Today's show is sponsored by Datadog, a cloud-scale monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and traces from technologies like Istio, AppMesh, and Envoy. Plus, Datadog's Service Map automatically plots out the dependencies in your microservices architectures for seamless, context-rich troubleshooting. With rich visualizations, algorithmic alerting, and more than 250 vendor-supported integrations, Datadog allows you to monitor your distributed applications in real time. Start a free 14-day trial today by visiting datadog.com/cloudcast. And Datadog will send you a great free t-shirt. That's datadog.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. We are wrapping up January of 2021 and beginning to look ahead to the later part of the, winter's almost over. We're getting closer to spring. So hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's kind of getting back into the swing of work and so forth in 2021. A lot of earnings announcements this week for our Cloud News of the Week. So we're going to kind of hit on that. We are kind of in the first of typically a 2-week kind of cloud earning announcements. A couple of companies announce a week early, and then a couple of other companies announced later. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. Microsoft announced their Q2 earnings, and from a cloud perspective, Azure was up about 50%. Microsoft as a whole was up 17% for the quarter. They had been up 12% previously a quarter before that. So continuing to see growth from Microsoft, but the Azure business, which obviously includes, they don't break it out per se. It's what they call intelligent cloud. It's still the one that's not explicitly broken out. But up 50%, inclusive of things like LinkedIn and GitHub and Office 365 and those sorts of things. So Azure continues to continue to grow very much on about a $14 billion quarter for that area. So about $60 billion cloud business. IBM announced their Q4 earnings. They were right around $20 billion. The IBM number was down about 6% year over year, but the Red Hat business was up 19%. So the Red Hat business now about a $5 billion business within IBM. Just to put that in perspective, when I joined Red Hat about 5 years ago, we were just around a $3 billion business. So, up almost nearly 100% in 5 years. So that is the healthy part of the IBM business. Intel announced their Q4 earnings. They were up 8% sort of for the year. So year over year, they announced not only their Q4 earnings, but the end of 2020 earnings. So up 8% year over year. They finished around $77 billion for the year. So interesting that, on what was, for 5 years of growth for the previous CEO, they are swapping out CEOs. Pat Gelsinger will be starting in February. So Intel is still generating a ton of cash, although they're, obviously going through some big transitions in the industry around what ARM's doing and whether they'll continue to be, manufacturers themselves or they'll start to, use contract manufacturers. So Intel will be an interesting hardware story in 2021 and beyond. Those were sort of the 3 big earnings announcements for the companies that are involved with the cloud. So, we're seeing some healthy growth across different sectors. In this case, both with Azure and with Red Hat, and then Intel, obviously, still growing and going through some transitions. A couple of other things we thought were interesting this week, not around announcements, but kind of around some of the open source things. Elasticsearch announced that they are making a change to their license for both Elasticsearch. Elastic made the announcement, making a change for Elasticsearch and Kibana. They are adopting the licensing model that Mongo had created. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but basically it sort of says if you're using this software as a cloud service, you not only have to open source how you're using it, so sort of give back any changes you make, but you have to open source the code that you use to run the service. And obviously, people like AWS and others are not going to open source how their cloud runs. So in response, Amazon created a fork of Elasticsearch, so the sort of Amazon fork of Elasticsearch. So it's going to be interesting to sort of watch how those things transition. We saw a similar thing happen with MongoDB. MongoDB tends to be doing very, very well with their Atlas product. The MongoDB stock is up about 100% over the last year. In fact, Elastic stock is up about 100% over the last year as well. So very, very interesting to see. Elastic has had a little more direct competition with Amazon, although both them and Mongo have as well. But interesting to see that Amazon has created a distinct fork of Elasticsearch for the open source community. So be interesting to see how that sort of plays out. And then finally, the folks at OSS Capital. So, some of the folks that have been looking at that space. It's interesting. They're going to launch an ETF, an exchange traded fund, in conjunction with NASDAQ, of open source companies in the summer of 2021. So we saw that announced. There's a link in the show notes. So sort of if you are interested in investing in the open source companies that you know and love, and you want to buy an index as opposed to the individual companies, there will apparently be an ETF that OSS Capital and NASDAQ will be rolling out in the summer of 2021. So lots of interesting things going on there, lots of sort of money discussion here in this week's Cloud News of the Week. We're going to not talk about money in the interview coming up. We're actually going to talk about transformation. So whether we talk about that as digital transformation, cultural transformation, kind of what it means to sort of embrace, sort of a software culture, a culture of learning. I'm very excited to do that with some very, very good friends of the show right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Okta. In these challenging times, we're all looking for simplicity, something that just works. The last thing you want to do is spend time building authentication for your new curbside pickup app. Because if you're spending time building your own authentication systems, it's time spent not making your customers happy. This is where Okta makes it simple. Okta's cloud-based authentication services are easy to set up, and they already integrate with the tools and applications you use today. Okta is trusted by companies like HPE, Splunk, CarMax, GitLab, and Cengage, plus many, many more. To take the hassle out of your authentication needs, visit okta.com/cloud and learn how to get started today. That's okta.com/cloud. Today's show is sponsored by BMC, and BMC wants to know, is your business on its A game? The A game is when systems are intelligent by learning from markets, where automation is paramount yet effortless, and when technology and people work as one in an enterprise. The A game is your business at its absolute best. BMC calls this the autonomous digital enterprise. Find out more at bmc.com/agame. That's bmc.com/agame. And we're back, and hopefully everybody has been enjoying the look-ahead shows that we're starting to do here in January, always some of our most popular shows. Like we said, we try and take a fairly big topic that we know a lot of people are very interested in, something that's, not going to necessarily get solved overnight, but something that we think will be something that you'll be talking about throughout the year, one way or the other, whether it's from the technology side or evolving your skills and so forth. And today we're going to talk about transformation, and we may end up calling it transformation. We may end up calling it digital transformation, but we all sort of know what it is. It's the idea that your business is where it is today, and when you look at the market, you look at your competitors, you look at how you do things, you realize you're going to have to do it differently to be successful. And so today, very excited to have two folks that are really kind of experts at this, and folks that I've been lucky enough to listen to for a long time. So I'm going to introduce both of them, and then I'm going to let them kind of give some background. So first off, Andrew Clay Shafer. Andrew, why don't you give folks a little bit, if they haven't heard your voice, a quick introduction and a little bit of your background.
Thanks, Brian, for having us. My background, before I came to Red Hat, I've been at Red Hat just over a year now. I started out in this sort of DevOps soup as a co-founder Puppet. Been working on startups before that, but really got into this sort of marriage of dev and ops and all these other things that come out of that. Spent all that time there, then was working on some OpenStack startup for a bit. They got sold to MC. Then ended up spending 5 years on a very similar thing. I won't say the name of the company.
It's okay.
Oh, well, I worked for Pivotal for 5 years, which is, we had some adventures. We built some things. There's a bunch of narratives that kind of come together, and then I got a unique opportunity. Really, really conversations with Jim Whitehurst and OpenOrg, and some of the unique cultural aspects of Red Hat were really compelling to come over here and go to try do something special with the Red Hat brand around bringing together the technology and the culture and process to do to just deliver better software outcomes. That's really been the focus of, I'd say, the last decade of my career is helping people put together better tools and better process. So it's the marriage of technology and people and skills to deliver the outcomes that drive their business.
Very cool. And our other guest today is somebody who's been on the show. It's been a long time, though. John Willis. John, welcome to the show. Give folks a little bit of your background, because it's somewhat similar to Andrew's in that it's very deep, it's very diverse, and it's hit on a lot of topics we've covered over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about it. I go back. I'd forgotten all about the sort of the early shows there. Anyway, yeah, no, me and Andrew have been sort of banging heads as friends and debating for many years, and it's just a sort of a brilliant friendship and working partnership. I've been doing this 40 years, I guess now it's a little more than 40 years, but the sort of the biggest thing that happened to me is like you sort of prior to the DevOps movement. Go look at my LinkedIn page, but really was sort of the start of the DevOps movement. Met Andrew very early on at Puppet, and begged Luke Kanice for a job for like 2 years, and he wouldn't give me a job. Kept telling me he didn't know what I could do there. And then met Adam Jacob at Chef, and sort of had that sort of ride over at Chef, and done a few startups, and then ran into the Docker folk, and sold a company to Docker. Spent some time at Docker, and then so about a little over a year ago, Andrew was putting together a team with Kevin Bear and Jay Bloom and Andrew, which I think these guys are the smartest people I know. And he invited me to this Red Hat party, and it's been a blast. And the only other part is I do a lot of sort of theory of the industry. I've written a couple of books, the DevOps Handbook, probably the most notable, but Beyond the Phoenix Project with Gene Kim, and a fair amount of publications. So yeah, that's why I'm Bachgaloop.
Yeah. And I would be incredibly surprised if at least 99% of the audience doesn't know of you guys, although maybe they haven't heard you on this podcast before. So excited to have you both on. Let's start, I guess, with a real big kind of area. So you guys both have become really well known in the DevOps space. You sort of invented it to a large extent. That was all about realizing that we don't necessarily build software, a decade ago, 15 years ago, in a way that was going to allow us to move fast and make changes. Those fundamental things are still in the conversations we have with, like, when we talk about transformation and digital transformation. We've now just sort of elevated the conversation to say, being good at software, better software is going to be really important to your business. It's not just a technology problem. As you guys get a chance, you get a chance to talk to both, kind of hardcore technicians, but also some pretty high level executives. Like, where is that conversation these days as you talk to, let's say, an executive of a Fortune 500 company today? Like, how do they frame up that transformation conversation? And then how do you sort of sit on the other side of the table and help them figure out how to move forward? Like, how do you help them think about it?
Let me take a quick swing. So one of the things I tell people, and sometimes people say things like, oh, you invented DevOps, or, this group of people invented DevOps. I don't think that. I don't think that way. I think what happened was I was in a very privileged position to watch a bunch of these patterns emerge, but the patterns were already there, right? And I put this in some of my presentations very explicitly, that there's a pretty famous Werner Vogel's interview where he's talking about, if you build it, you run it. That interview is from 2006. DevOps is not a word until 2009. Okay. So there's sort of the primordial emergent practice that's coming from the Darwinian pressure to deliver and build these services. I think it's also worth noting that part of this transition, and this is how it kind of connects back into Agile and some of these other buzzwords, is that software, we keep talking about software and software is eating the world, but the reality is actually more on some level about the infrastructure that enables some of the software. There's been software for decades before the internet enabled these experiences that we are starting to take for granted. And without that infrastructure, without that kind of connectivity and the computing power that we all get to carry in our pockets, none of this would have been possible. So it's really the confluence of all these things that elevates operations. So in the beginning of the Agile manifesto, my background was as a software developer before I started getting into more of the automation stuff. In the beginning, software was shipped on physical media, shipped on CDs, and ops in that context was only really worried about keeping the workstations and maybe the mail servers or whatever running, but you just didn't have the same kind of pressure to deliver reliability, scalability, flexibility that we take for granted more and more. Or I think another thing to kind of come back to answer the question, and then I'll hand it back to John to make comments, is that in our enterprise context, we have individuals who experience those digital realities every single day. It's not like they don't have a cell phone. It's not like they don't have a Gmail, Twitter, Facebook, whatever,
Right.
TikTok, whatever the cool kids are using these days. They're immersed in that world all day, every day. And then they end up in their kind of enterprise IT context, and they're dealing with systems that are Byzantine. In some cases, maybe even seem like they're designed to be actually hostile to human beings, right? And so kind of finding that balance where the cognitive dissonance about what we know is possible as individuals, because we experience it constantly every single day, and what we are delivering to our own organizations and to our customers is where I think there's these huge opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to sort of Andrew's point, there's like this beautiful shoulder of giants. Andrew and I will often be introduced as the creative of DevOps, and like, all right, calm down, everybody. I mean, we were privileged to be in incredible places. I was in Ghent by accident for the first DevOps day, right? 11 years ago. But I love to point out, most people remember this when in presentations over the last 10 years, there's this canonical picture of like this sort of pipeline of green, green, red, green, 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 red. It's like this, like the sort of Andon Cordes way of showing continuous delivery. Well, that slide, if you go to Wikipedia, was actually done in a 2006 Agile presentation by Jez Humble, Dan North, and Chris Reed, right? Like in 2006. And you will see that slide in a presentation sometime this year, and people go, ooh, look at that. So the point is, there's a lot of prior art, and I won't even get into all the sort of lean that we realized that we really sort of lean. But I think sort of moving forward, and again, usually Andrew says these things way better than I do, and so I'll just take a quote from Andrew. Andrew, one of my favorite all-time quotes in sort of the DevOps space, or if we call it digital or digital transformation, or if we call it chicken soup, I don't care. The point that Andrew has this quote, it says, you're either building a learning organization or you're losing to somebody who is. And I think that says it all. To me, that's the sort of stake in the ground about, that's what Toyota did. That's what, sort of successful organizations that understand this, they get that correct. And what that means is a whole opportunity to learn what that means. But I think, in answer to your question, to me, that's the stake in the ground.
Yeah. Well,
and we see this. We see this day to day. And just to add one quick point to what John has said is, you go into some of these enterprises and you look at what they're doing, from a technology perspective and from a process perspective, and you can almost tell what year they stopped learning. It's like a time capsule. And like, this is the stack that was, a good idea this year. It seemed like a good idea at the time.
Or it's a change in management, really, right? Too, right? That's beautiful. Like from that synergy of looking at it, right? Like you can actually see, oh look, a new CIO came in, and all this stuff anyway. So yeah.
So that's the sedimentary layers of
yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah.
So let me follow up on that. So forget about the other words, right? So we've evolved over time. You start talking to somebody, whether you're in an event or you're in an actual meeting or whatever it is, and you're trying to gauge from them, like, where are you in, like, are you a learning organization? Because it's not a binary thing necessarily, right? Like, yeah, there's plenty of organizations that you feel like they're stuck in the mud, but like, are there questions you ask people where you kind of get a feel for like, okay, you guys still have some amount of learning going on, or you have the right mindset that, if we help you a little bit, like we can accelerate your learning? Like how do you understand if somebody's, learning or not? Like, how does that work out? How do you think about it?
Yeah, let me take a quick crack on it, and then I'll let Andrew expand on it. I think there are telltale signs, right? And there's many, but one for sure is like how you think about blame, right? That's a sort of glaring organization that is not open to learning, right? If you're sort of like, it's sort of retribution and like, we found the person, and like, there's been tons of literature from the safety community, resilience, Dr. Woods, Decker, John Allspar, those people that we've absorbed well. So that's just one area. And there's so many more where these telltale signs that you're just not a learning organization. if you don't understand, like you're getting into a postmortem and it's all about finding the blame or the root cause, and then if you're not looking at your pipeline as this beauty. I talked about the green, red. I mean, those reds are the end-on chords. They're the feedback loops that you get to quicker, and we try to catch those earlier. We talk about shift left. So I won't go through all of those, but and we all on this call know this, that there are all those things that you can spot, and they all sort of add up to. That's why I said in the last comment that it really sort of adds up that you're really not a learning organization.
Yeah. So going back to the quote that John gave as attribution, that same quote builds up to, before I say you're building a learning organization or losing someone who is, I say you're building, you're building software, you're losing someone who is, and kind of like connects it back to this digital thing. And in that same presentation, there's this research that I stumbled into. It's been, almost 10 years ago now, around the organizational learning. So dimensions of organizational learning. If you get into the literature, there's like this nuanced difference between learning organizations and organizational learning, and like some of that has to do with politics of academics or whatever. So it doesn't really matter for our purposes. But the 7 dimensions is a very interesting framing that gives you ways to kind of explore on these different spectrum. Whether this is an organization that has a capacity for learning, or to the extent that they're invested. And some of it has to do with what percentage of your focus is on getting work done and versus like improving the way that you actually work, right? So you have to make investments. I think this is true whether you're individual or an organization, right? If you want to get better at playing a musical instrument, if you want to get better at playing chess or any of these other skills, there's kind of like well understood process where you have to push the boundaries of your comfort and skill level to be able to kind of get to those higher level things. And the reason I was so excited when I first stumbled into that, and this goes back to trying to help people with all these other tools and Puppet and Agile and whatever DevOps, like you could give the same organization or what looked like very similar organizations in terms of size and scale and even business, the same exact training, the same exact tools, and they would get very, very different outcomes. And in some cases, they would exceed what you thought was possible for them. And in other cases, they would come back and tell you that, your advice wasn't good or it wasn't even, useful. And the difference, what I came to kind of accept is that learning capability, that ability to change, and there's simpler models like the double loop learning or whatever. It's like, how willing are you to revisit your fundamental assumptions so that you can make new ones and test new ones? Another book that's interesting, it's from kind of the same like group of people, Barry O'Reilly's Unlearn book, which I don't know if anyone's seen that. That's a pretty good read that kind of frames some of this in the context of it, like in it's weird language because it's like you unlearn. It's really learning, but in order to learn, sometimes you have to be able to revisit some of your assumptions. And a lot of us, both as individuals and as organizations, get fixated on a certain point because in reality, what's happened is you won a game, like you sort of won a game with that behavior, but now the game's different. Okay. Like that. This is a point that I make pretty strong in the talk that John's referencing. You have those behaviors ingrained because they actually got you something. They won you some game. It's just now that the game's changed, can you keep up with the new rules?
Right. And obviously, as you transition, say from one type of game to another game or, one set of goals to another, right, you've got, certain existing power structures or existing hierarchies. Those may not necessarily carry over. Like, do you guys find, is there something that, or, some set of patterns that sort of lend themselves to being able to transition from one to the other? Like, for example, like, do you need sort of a crisis within your organization to be able to go, yeah, we can think about things differently? Or is it just you need a few really strong personalities? I mean, like, what are some of the things that
I'm going to go jump because I like the Simon Sinek stuff. I mean, surely crises create opportunities, no question about it, right? But those are sort of latent in their sort of discovery and the companies that have sort of better learning, better just overall structure in these sort of transformational attributes that we admire, we'll do better. The COVID was example, right? Like I did some studies on some, I interviewed like 20 companies that what they did. But I do think I really like the Simon Sinek stuff, whether it's sort of intent-based, but it's the why. And, if you've read his book, Start With Why, or that whole idea, whether you hate the book or like the idea that like, if you figure out your why, then these are not, sort of catastrophic changes. The one example I love is if the railroad companies, back, 200 years ago or 150 years ago, whatever, would have seen themselves in the transportation business, they would have structured trucking. And so as highways came, but they sort of fell apart because they thought they were the railroads companies, the train companies. And he's got many examples. So I do think the companies that can figure out their true why are better enabled to deal with these sort of, there's sort of dimensional changes. There's, I forget, the Perez woman who has this incredible, I hate mentioning things when I can't remember what they are, but the Carlotto Perez, right, has this brilliant thing about these transformational divides that happen over the last couple of years. And I think the companies that are sort of understand their why fundamental, look at Apple, like they seem to just sort of roll with the, because I think they have a better understanding of their why than some companies that sort of fixed on we're a printing company or, anyway.
So I want to extend that idea a little bit. And there's what is the company's why, and sometimes that why needs to change.
Yes.
And then there's to what extent does that company unify the why internally? So if you look at some of the struggles people have, with the DevOps conversation and about delivering some of these outcomes, the struggle is because you have these local personas, localized optima for dev that's at odds with the localized optima for ops. And, we've sort of expanded that with the conversation we've been having recently with some of Jabe's stuff around the kind of tension between innovation and efficiency. But what you want to be able to do, and I think this is true whether you're talking about dev and ops or really about any team, sports team, what have you, is everyone there for the same why? Is everyone there to build the same cathedral, if you will? So when you look at what happens, everyone has a different why. Like I have many whys. I have a wife, I have children, I have all these other interests. And then it's like you come to work and when you're at work in the context of that organization, is everyone unifying their why? And I think that, and most people have some experience with this, that there's a lot of kind of friction and heat that's burned off in a lot of organizations because they don't unify. And there's a bunch of other issues. One of the things I'm fond of saying recently is if you'll show me your org charts and your funding model, I'll predict all your problems. I'll predict where you have these friction points. So I think that getting those unified whys, and that's a function of leadership, that's a function of culture, that's a function of these other things, is really what allows companies to do special things. And if you've ever been part of a team that had that alignment, then you'll always long for it if you don't have it.
Right. Well, and unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, they either look at it and they go, look, I can't impact the why, right? Like I can't change this from being a railroad company to a trucking company, or, I can't maybe necessarily change this from being a pizza place to a home delivery. Like, there's some struggles with that. And then there's times when, that may last for 4 or 5 years. Like you said, you get into a great situation that lasts for 4 or 5 years. I think that's sometimes the struggle I hear from people is they go, that's cool. I know what our why is, but how do I impact that?
But there always is why, right? Like that's the thing I think most corporations lose, right? Is that when they can figure out like why they were created. One of the things I loved about Chef, and it isn't a good example when we're talking about billion-dollar corporations, but one thing about Chef is Jesse Robbins was the CEO there, and he'd always say that we're sysadmins that are building a sysadmin tool for sysadmins. Right. Like, and that was about the time I was reading Simon Sinek stuff. I'm like, oh my God, like this is, they always said Apple creates or Etsy was a good example, but Apple is a good example. Like the kind of products they create are the kind of products that the people who buy them, there's this camaraderie and
virtual tribe that's created.
Yeah, and I just think that some companies just lose that. These companies that started, every one of these companies started somewhere.
Right.
GE is good. GE has a why. They may have a lot of problems with GE Digital and all that stuff that went on over the last few years, but like they talk about being the original entrepreneur, Thomas Edison company, right? Like any sort of executive who talks about GE will start with that sort of story, like especially if they're in a startup domain or Eric Ries stuff, they will brag about, we are the original entrepreneurial organization. And they've kept that.
So I want to key off one of the examples you just gave about how, individuals don't feel like they can impact the larger why, and connect it back to the dimensions of organizational learning. And we don't have time to go through the whole questionnaire, but one of the things that they ask is to what extent can everyone participate in inquiry and dialogue regardless of their rank. Mm-hmm. Right? So if you don't have a mechanism for the lowest ranked people to provide inquiry and feedback to the highest ranked people, there's a tendency to what I'll call green shifting, where at the lowest level everything is on fire, everyone knows everything is red. But as it goes up the management chain, when it gets to the top level of management, everything's green, and so then you kind of like get in this cycle where you're not actually optimized to be competitive, and everyone's sort of doing their thing. But for whatever reason, and it goes back to some of the things John was saying about blame, they don't have that information at the leadership level to make good decisions that would change those outcomes.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean I think you're right. You got to give people at least some amount of belief that they can be part of it, and they may not necessarily drive it completely themselves, but they can be a part of it, and they see the transparency of it.
I think belief's an interesting word. So belief's part of it, but I think one way to make people believe it is actually do it.
Yeah, and you asked earlier about like what are some of the signs that somebody isn't learning or they stop learning or whatever. And to Andrew's point, it's that if you can through conversation or discovery find out that there is this sort of that sort of like, why are you talking now? You've only been here a year. Like if you can evidence of there's that sort of culture. To Andrew's point, whether it's dimensional learning or it's the psychological safety research that Google did, or any of the discussions around this idea that like anybody, an organization should embrace inquiry at all costs from anybody, diversity, length of employment. In fact, the more, I got to say one quick, so I always got to tell stories. I remember in the early days, Facebook in the DevOps days, they'd show up and they'd give these presentations and they'd talk about how their developers, and everybody in the early days DevOps would brag about how quick their developers could push to production, right? There was this sort of badge of honor. And I remember in one presentation, it was a large group, and Facebook talked about, our developers pushed to production on the first day, and it was some enterprise person. They said, yeah, but what if they break the system? And the guy thought for a second, he said, well, actually, if they break the system, they're pretty darn smart. They're probably going to get promoted because they've just outsmarted, 5,000 developers, So anyway, it's that kind of attitude really that creates sort of these optimum strategies for success.
Yeah. Interesting. I want to shift gears a little bit. Obviously, both of you, while you spend a lot of your time, thinking about these patterns, you've done a ton of research around it from a people culture perspective. You also have pretty deep backgrounds on the technology side of things, especially on the ops side of things. As you're talking to colleagues, people in the industry about how ops has evolved now to be part of what people will call cloud native or these transformations, like how has that changed? Like what are the things if you kind of walk through somebody like kind of a checklist and you go, I want to do the equivalent of if you're a learning organization, but I want to look at it from kind of tech and ops and stuff. Like what are some of those things that you sort of know right away if they're doing something, they're doing it well. If they're not doing it, they're going to have a much bigger learning curve to make the software team successful.
I can go ahead. I was going to tell the story that I learned from you, which was, when I first met Luke and Andrew, they were telling me how, John, operations are going to start storing their stuff in source control, and they're going to act more like developers. And I had been like 15 years in like enterprise sysadmin. I'm like, you guys are out of your mind. That ain't going to happen. And it wasn't until I saw that presentation by Andrew that he was talking about. back at like it was O'Reilly in 2009, I think, and he, I was like, oh my God, I get what he's saying. Yes, ops does have to be like developers, and that's what DevOps is all about. So it was really an epiphany that I got from Andrew on, like, I was old school, and I just thought, this is insane. These guys they're young kids that don't know what the hell they're talking about.
So I kind of came into this narrative from the other side. Like I was a software developer, or I was at least employed as a software developer. In some ways, I aspire to be a mathematician, but that's a much longer, or a scientist, much longer story. But you stumble into these things and you do what you can. So coming into it, there's like these conversations that I used to get internally. Like I'd get really kind of frustrated and mad when you talk to someone and they would make comments like those monkeys in operations, or like they would basically dehumanize the work and the contribution of this like whole class of people. And part of it was, related to how the racking and stacking, and there's actually like a physical aspect of it in so many of these contexts. But then when you get to the current situation and what's going on with what we'll call cloud native, and then there's this other kind of buzzword du jour around SRE, which I'll essentially, I believe that's sort of like the DevOps implementation at Google. But the thing to focus on that connects back to what John was saying is the E part. That there's the aspect of engineering, right? And so it's bringing engineering mindset and development to that thing. But I would argue that this is the defining advantage of the true cloud natives, is their operational excellence. That's right. So they're excellent in terms of their technology. They're excellent in terms of their process. It doesn't mean they're perfect. It doesn't mean that there's not problems left to solve, but it's really bringing that innovation mindset, that engineering mindset, to the operational domain that gives you things like Kubernetes, right? So this is software managing these things. And then to the point of what ops looks like. So I give this presentation lately about cloud native operating models. And I talk about this stratification from applications to platforms to like actual core infrastructure. And each one of those has an operational burden, right? So the software itself, the applications at the highest level have an operational burden. Then below them, you have the platform, which is an application in its own right, which has an operational burden. And then at the very, very bottom, you have infrastructure, which may have another abstraction, infrastructure as a service, which is itself a platform, which is itself software, which needs to be operated. And then very, very, very bottom, there's silicon and electricity and all that stuff. And what's happening, and when you talk, and go back to the quote I already mentioned about Werner, when he says you build it, you run it, Werner's not talking about two pizza teams laying out their stuff in the data center, getting power and ping, installing operating systems. He's talking about something that's predicated on all those layers already being in place, already being operated at a high level of reliability. So the team that is you build it, you run it, they're just running that top layer of the software stack, right? And so what I argue, or what I like to say, is that operations moves up the stack, right? So all this value is created and commoditized at the bottom. The real kind of new value is, and innovation happens at the top, and operations is just tracking that same curve. So operations, I don't think ever goes away, in the sense that you're always going to have an operational burden. Every application is going to have some operational aspect, but what those activities look like will change, right? And we're in the midst of some new models emerging when you start to think about serverless, when you start to think about edge, right? So, and this is relevant to some of the stuff going on with Red Hat right now, is that you have this pretty well defined to some degree, or at least, people who've seen and experienced it know what the DevOps SRE type operating models look like, to have these sort of cloud central core services, the stuff you can copy from all the lessons learned building the big web. But when you start to get to the edge, when you start to get to devices, when you start to get to all these other types of things, those are emergent. There's not really some best practice that you can go copy off someone else, because the core services you can, but the rest of those models we have to define as we go.
Yeah, no, I agree. It is this sort of constant evolution, and I think you talk about it a lot. It's while we're layering software on top of each other, there's also got to be the thing that, the lower level things have to become more consistent, more automated, because you can't keep layering sort of complexity on top of complexity. There's got to be points where, things become automated, things become standardized. You don't allow as many sort of nerd knobs and things to happen. And
It's one of the things I think the cloud natives were forced to do, right? So it's a Darwinian aspect of it, is that the human mind can only manage so much complexity, right? And organizationally, as you start to connect this together, maybe we can manage more. But what all the cloud natives really did, and this is sort of represented in when people talk about hyperscalers or hyperconverged or whatever, is they collapse the complexity towards the bottom of the stack, right? So instead of having the life cycle of an application tied to hardware, where you're doing a PO per app, and then you have the life cycle of that little unit in the rack for that application, you're abstracting these things that are racks and racks, rows and rows of identical hardware with the infrastructure layer, infrastructure service layer. And so then it's not that you don't have complexity from that added abstraction, it's that you get this level of consistency where you can spend your complexity budget at those higher order, higher level, hopefully differentiate things. And you see that come up the stack. So at the very, very bottom, there's a lot of standardization, a lot of consolidation, use abstractions to provide and as you come up the stack, you have different runtimes and maybe all the, that's another thing that's interesting watching some of these conversations in the enterprises. They're like, well, we want to enable the developers. We want to give them autonomy. If you go to Facebook or you go to Google, they don't let you run whatever language you want. They don't, right? Okay. And Netflix had you could basically do anything you wanted on the Java paths, and you could do anything you wanted, but then you had to go back through kind of a more traditional management process to introduce those variations, because there is an ongoing. You're adding an operational complexity and an operational burden every time you add a new runtime.
Right.
I mean, I learned this from Simon, about, when I first started working with Simon Wardley back when, that, what is it, the componentization by Herbert Simon, right? Like, so to what we said earlier, right, there's sort of nothing really new here, but yeah.
Yeah, it's nothing new, just faster processors, more bandwidth, and on-demand stuff.
And a bunch of people trying to make sense of the complexity. Right?
Exactly. Guys, I'm gonna wrap it up there. I know people are listening. We had a very, very long list of topics. I knew we'd only get through a certain number of them. Kind of as I think about this in summary, the kind of the big important takeaways. Learning organizations, right? Understanding where you are. Are you a learning organization? Do you have the capabilities to do it? Do you allow your people to give feedback? Do you allow them to take part in the change? I think that was really important. You guys highlighted that. And then obviously, as you're implementing these things, the importance of making sure that those platform teams, that the operations, the automation that goes with that is kind of rock solid. So like you said, you can get into those mentalities of you build it, you run it, or you can deliver self-service so people can go at the pace they want to. Last, I'll give you guys the last word, and I'll hold you to the last word. Kind of, if you're giving anybody a 1-minute tip, you're on an elevator, they're like, hey, I gotta kick off this transformation thing. What is that one thing you're sort of like, just make sure you do this, or, if you do nothing else, do this. Any tips for folks?
You want to go first?
Yeah. I guess I'd have to just go back to really try to understand that quote by Andrew and really embrace, people yell at me all the time, but doesn't yell at me, but like, oh my God, in his presentation, he's now introduced 4 new books I got to read, right? Like, sorry, and I think there's just so much great material out there, and do you allow your organization the bandwidth to learn, right? I guess that's it. Like, give if I'd be forced the elevator pitch, which I've already blown, but is like, give your people the ability, don't put them at 100% capacity, allow them, encourage them, promote them, and allow them the bandwidth to be learners, to let the organization become a learning organization.
Good stuff. Andrew, anything to add?
Yeah, related to that and kind of related to the narrative we're building together at Red Hat is that there's a lot of these lessons that are already learned outside of your walls. and connect yourself to that greater learning. And then kind of to connect back to the points you made and John made, is that I feel like the more you can have a culture that is able to foster inquiry and authentic critique, process that in a positive way, and then focus on making things more and more excellent, then you're going to get pretty good outcomes.
Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Guys, I want to thank you for all the time today. I know usually I've got to travel a couple of thousand miles to go see you talk somewhere at one of the events, so I appreciate the time today. Folks, with that, I'm going to wrap it up for myself and Aaron, and obviously thank you to both Andrew and John for their time today. Where this is going to be sort of part 2 of the 4 looking ahead series for 2021 shows we're doing in January. I hope you enjoy them. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for giving the show feedback on Apple Podcasts and other places. And with that, we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.